Dear guests here at the studio, dear online viewers, we have arrived to the last panel discussion of this European Ideas Forum 2022. Geopolitical Realities in a Changing World is the title of the panel, and we look forward to our panelists shedding light on the shifting geopolitical landscapes. To keep the debate lively, I invite you to use the hashtag EIF22 on slido.com by leaving your comments and answer to the following Slido question. What would be the most effective method to ensure the strategic security interests of the EU? A. Speeding up the EU enlargement process. B. Intensifying cooperation with non-EU like-minded member states. C. Intensifying the presence of the EU in international organizations. With that said, I would now like to give the floor to the Martens Center Policy Director, Mr. Peter Heffele. Peter, the floor is yours.
Sandra, thank you very much for your kind invitations, ladies and gentlemen, here in the room and online. A very warm welcome to the last panel of our European Ideas Forum. I'm very delighted and honored to have such a high-ranking audience and speakers with us, which I will introduce in a second. As I mentioned, the event is live streamed as well, so I would like to welcome the audience all around the globe, I hope. And, well, in general, we will tap into the geopolitical elephants, such as the war in Ukraine, the rise of China, and, of course, the impact, for example, on global trade architecture. But as we flag this event, the European Ideas Forum, I would like to dig a bit deeper into the topics, what it means for Europe and from Europe, such, for example, that the development of a new strategic culture, the constitutional framework we are operating here in Europe, and the chances and limitations of the transatlantic relations, but also beyond that, for example, into the Asia-Pacific region. Well, to tackle all these questions, 45 minutes is rather an ambitious goal. So with the first round of questions I will pose to you, we should keep it very shortly. Then we open the discussions, and as Sandra just mentioned, we have the option to get your ideas and questions into through the Slido platform, so be prepared. We will later on then integrate this in our discussions. So let me just briefly introduce, and Radosław, if you allow, I will start with the ladies here. Susan, you are the face and voice of America, I would say, in Brussels, having served here for many years now, being the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU. You represent thousands of companies here in the US, but it's more than just the business issue. I think it's the whole policy field. So we are very much interested in having the voice and the perspectives from the United States here. Teresa, we have met several times. You are the director and founder of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia. That is quite an ambitious one. You're also the member of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, and also one leg, at least, in the United States, being a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Foreign and Global Affairs. And Radosław, last but not least, you're very well known, not only during your former positions in your home country in Poland as the Security and Defense Minister, Foreign Affairs issues, but now even more here in Europe, in the European Parliament, in the Committee of Foreign Affairs, Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and Subcommittee of Security Defense. So the whole range and the whole issues. Radosław, I would like to start our first round asking you, in my observation, one of the most striking developments in recent months is not only due to the aggression of Russia into Ukraine, is the internal power shift within the European Union. In our last panel, Jamie touched upon this issue, how the geography of power within Europe might have changed, and I think it's particularly clear for your home country that Poland really makes a difference now, and this is, for example, my home country, Germany, a huge issue to understand how power shifts have happening, how old traditional axes such as Paris, Berlin might lose influence and new powers might emerge. What conclusions do you draw out of this development? Am I right with my observation? And is the current political framework in Europe suitable for this, or do we have to think of different approaches? So what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think Brexit adversely affected the internal balance of power because a major country left the EU, leaving two very large member states. The average EU state is 18 million, and France and Germany are much more than that. So I'm glad that we have made Ukraine a candidate, because the accession of Ukraine will rebalance the EU again. But of course, this is going to be a huge challenge. What we are expecting from Germany is for you to start doing what your chancellor said you would do, which is to start taking defense seriously.
Mm-hmm. If we look beyond the borders, because the topic of our panel is now also geopolitics, and I mentioned that issue, it's not just the periphery, which of course absorbs a lot of power for the moment, but looking beyond, for example, also in the Mediterranean area or even the Indo-Pacific, which I will later discuss, of course, with you from the US perspective. But this is something which is in our minds, or have we completely focused only on these narrow perspectives? Which would
I think our first duty should be to stabilize our two neighborhoods, which are both on fire in the south and in the east. And we don't have the instruments to do it yet, which is why I hope we do what the strategic compass envisages. And we had some votes at the AFET today. We need to create a rapid reaction force that can back up our diplomacy with force if need be, and in case the Americans are engaged in the Far East. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is literally the last warning for us to become serious.
Mm-hmm. Teresa, the word of the year might be the German word, German expression of Zeitenwende, time shift, and the claims for a new strategic culture. We have touched upon that in recent debates. I'm always wondering, isn't it rather our perception of things happening than the things themselves having changed? Is there really this big rupture in the strategic and geostrategic environment we are calling it now, or is it rather we have closed our eyes? And I think if I read your articles over the last years correctly, you always had been very outspoken on the dramatic changes, be it China, be it Russia, but apparently it often felt on deaf ears. Is this different this time? Do you really believe in the time shift?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I don't take it for granted seeing people in real life, so I'm very honored to be here. And I should just add that the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, CREAS, was founded 6 years ago because I'd lived in Russia for 5.5 years, and then I lived in China for 4. So when I came back to Brussels, I'd lived in Brussels previously for 3 years. When I finally came back to Brussels, I thought, wow, everyone's really going to see the connections between Russia and China. And there was still a silo effect going on. So sometimes I would do some talks at NATO, and they're like, why are you at a place called Asia Studies? So I had to actually found a center that tried to connect the dots between Russia and China. So finally, we are doing that now. And we've seen, for example, with the February 4th document that both Putin and Xi signed just prior to the Olympics in Beijing, it's very strong, this relationship. And for those who've been paying attention, as you kindly mentioned, this has been going on for many years. And this idea of cooperation, strategic alignment between Russia and China. And to prepare for this event, I looked at the talk last year, and the first speaker, who is a former Prime Minister of Finland, he said there are 3 strategic blocks in the world. So he said the US, China, and the EU. And he's from a country that shares a border with Russia, and he never even mentioned Russia. But he, so I think everyone now is paying a great deal of attention to Russia, and this idea, as MEP Sikorski noted, our neighborhood is on fire. So this idea of having a ring of friends, instead we're surrounded by a ring of fire. So this idea of geopolitics is actually quite new to EU institutions. I've lived in this town for 15 years now, altogether almost 20, with internships and things like that from my youth. But The idea that we don't do geopolitics was part of the mantra in EU institutions. So anything that was happening outside this lovely garden of the EU was something that wasn't really on their agenda. So the fact that they have a strategic compass is a really positive step. And I'm really glad to see that. And the other issue is, the other mantra was, there is no such thing as a hard power solution. And we see now with Russia, hard power is something that we must address. And the idea of geopolitics, because this is about geopolitical realities in a changing world, we saw today NATO actually discussed with European partners. There's only 4 EU member states that are not a member of NATO. So there's even closer cooperation between NATO and the EU. And I think that living in this town, there used to be 2 elephants that never really spoke to each other. And we see with this new geopolitical era, there's a lot more cooperation and discussion. And I think it can improve. But it's a good positive trajectory. Because there are many things that the EU can do that NATO can't do, especially in regard to the economic angle. We saw strategic investments, perhaps in commanding heights, the electric grid, nuclear power stations, ports. We know that Germany just sold 24.9% of a key German port, even though members of the German coalition were against it, and 6 ministries, including intelligence. So have we learned some lessons about overdependence on Russia? I think people talk about overdependence on Russia, but they don't seem to want to apply those same lessons to China.
I take this issue of the like-minded partners, for example, later on, because the question we here raised to the public indeed is about that question. But the other point you mentioned, the economic issues, of course, so that is something which naturally comes into our mind if we talk about the transatlantic relations. It has improved, definitely, I would say, over the last years, but nonetheless, there are a lot of roadblocks still out there in the defense issue, in the digitalization issues, data security issues. We are on a good way, I would say, but the roadblocks remain to some extent. And one has to ask, of course, the current economic crisis, might this rather endanger this improvement of relations? Think about the fighting against inflation, for example, shielding economies against the impacts of whatever adverse powers or economic reasons. So where do you see the transatlantic relations for the moment, and what can still be improved, of course?
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here as well, and great to meet everybody, even though some people are behind me, and a bit like Teresa, just to put it out there as well, AmCham proudly represents, actually, indeed, thousands of smaller companies, but actually 165 US companies, which we classify as committed to and invested in Europe. And indeed, where does the transatlantic relationship stand? It's a big question. In brief, indeed, we've had some very turbulent years. Maybe one comment on the geopolitics to put that in perspective. I think as a business organization, it's important to stress that we're representing businesses here. We're non-political. So that's just to put it out there, first of all. And actually, business for many years did sort of stand back and feel, this is not our world, geopolitics, it's out there, but we're just going to get on with what we're doing here. A bit like you said, Teresa, we don't have to comment or touch on that. This is not affecting us. I mean, there was a big shift back in 2007, 2008, when the reality was the economic crisis is definitely impacting us. We have to be speaking out, doing more. And we've, during that time since then, with regard to the transatlantic relationship, made big efforts. I think it's worth mentioning the TTIP, so the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, where we tried very hard to advance the economic relationship. We've had some turbulent years with the previous US administration under President Trump. I would say in brief, the last 2 years have been a lot better. The tone has changed. We felt and feel that we are making big advancements with regard to the overall relationship, a lot more communication, a lot more back and forth, a lot more will there. We've seen, I've got to mention the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, as a concrete example of a forum that has now been set up with exactly this goal in mind, not specifically now to try again for a trade agreement, but to really be a forum for improving and building upon the relationship and creating more understanding, which is maybe a theme I can come back to later. Where we stand at this present moment in time, and you alluded to that, Peter, I think, is there are some potential roadblocks there, which we've got to be very careful of avoiding. This is sort of top of mind at the moment. There is a TTC, it's called, Trade and Technology Council Ministerial coming up this Monday. We want that to be a success. It needs to be a success. There are some concrete deliverables that on the table that the principals want to put out there with regard to taking this relationship forward. There is what's called the Inflation Reduction Act that came out several months ago now, which is making the media, making the headlines. We have to be very careful that this does not detract from what we are trying to achieve through the TTC. So I think, that's my message for today. Where does the relationship stand? I believe there is a lot of goodwill there on both sides. Everyone wants this to work. We as AmCham-EU and the business community are absolutely behind the need for the EU and US to cooperate in today's world with all these other players. Like you said, Teresa, a few years ago, we just talked about the EU and the US. Now there may be 4 players. I don't know. You've got India out there as well. It's multipolar. So we have to stand together. So maybe I'll just leave it there with the message that we have to create a better understanding of both sides. It's not a given that we understand each point of view, but we have to work together. So I see it as a crucial moment for next week, but we've got to remain positive and do our bit to drive this forward.
And it's definitely not the governments themselves. It's a vast network, and we as Martens Center, for example, consider, of course, ourselves as part of this transatlantic improvement, but chambers of commerce, academic institutions, parliaments, I think, absolutely crucial. Back to this issue of the strategic culture and the development, what do you think should be done also by institutions such as us to improve this? There's a lot of established coalitions, corporations, exchange programs, but Radosław, on the parliament's level, for example, which is often a weak point, have I observed in international relations. It's government to government, the traditional ones, but I think parliaments play an absolutely crucial role. Maybe some observations from your side.
Well, Bob Kagan once said that Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus, and I think that's broadly correct. The European Union was founded as a war preventative mechanism, and therefore we tend to think that things can be resolved through dialogue, through trade, through enlargement, through concessions. And we now have a Genghis Khan on our borders who believes that conquest is the solution. You mentioned that the mantra for decades has been, there is no hard power solution. But actually, when you say that, it means that you're ready to capitulate. And we shouldn't capitulate to Putin. And therefore, we need to change our strategic culture. And we need to defend our values. We need to defend our friends and allies. And it's almost too late. There's an old saying that countries and groups of countries reform themselves when it's almost too late. And that moment has just arrived.
Teresa, you could observe this process of changing minds. We both lived abroad. We have sometimes warned earlier, but apparently deaf eyes and ears are everywhere. What did change in your observation? What really triggered, and how can we continue this momentum?
Well, as we know, the European Union tends to respond to crises, and this is what they've done. But I think it's been really dramatic, and I think everybody was so pleased at the dramatic moves that they did make. Now, they have to keep it going. It's very difficult. I don't think neither Putin nor Xi Jinping expected such solidarity among EU member states. We even saw neutral countries like Switzerland put sanctions on Russia. So this was an incredible period. But there's a danger now. We're seeing a fragmenting of narratives. The longer this war goes on, there's going to be an attempt to try to break the solidarity within the EU. We see almost another pole coming up between Central Eastern Europeans and the Baltics because they're right on the front line. They understand how serious and how high the stakes are. So I think that it's important to maintain the solidarity. And I think, we've seen the EU, we've seen Ursula von der Leyen really grow into her position, I would say. And I think that she's done an amazing job. But the key thing now is, you talked about, the different mentalities of Venus, Mars, and I love that. That's a great reminder. And I think that strengthening the European pillar within NATO, we've seen 2 EU member states, Sweden and Finland, traditionally neutral, asking to join NATO. So I think that that's a real sign that we already have this institution established. Let's strengthen the European pillar within it, because we don't have the luxury of time at this point. And we really have to think far more strategically. As I speak, Charles Michel is traveling to Beijing. We saw the Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, travel immediately to Beijing right after the party congress. What kind of messages are they sending to Beijing? I think we really have to see the world as it is, not as we would like it to be.
As an economist, I always talk about resources, and I remember very well, Susan, the discussion on the US side that Europe has to put more resources, not only in defense, and engaging more globally. And keeping in mind what you mentioned, that it's beyond into the Asia Pacific, for example, which will be the most important theater probably. And in the US, the answer is quite clear. It's the Western Pacific which matters. So in terms of mobilizing resources, maintaining this momentum you mentioned, what do you think from a US perspective? Is it credible? Are the Europeans really up to maintain and even engage more? Because it's their periphery, their backyard?
I think it's probably more for Radoslaw to comment on that, but I think, you know, on the economic side, they need to be. I think that the challenge at the moment is the short-term challenges that we have balanced against the bigger picture. I mean, we absolutely agree. This is, you know, the what's going on in Ukraine, the war, as businesses are absolutely condemning. We condemn it, and we must be careful that fatigue does not come in, which you're seeing a little bit already in terms of even just being talked about in Brussels, if we're honest. It's talked about far less. We've got to be very careful about that. But the challenge here is the actual economic challenges we see every day and the ones that are affecting citizens, the energy crisis, the cost of living, and how we address that while keeping the bigger picture in mind with the investments that are going to be needed for ensuring the strength of Europe, strength of the relationship going forward as well. I mean, one of the big concerns that business has at the moment, I would say in Europe, is the competitiveness of Europe and the attractiveness of Europe. So, you know, to your question of whether does Europe have the capacity and the economic capacity to support, it's got to ensure that its economy remains strong. So, you know, one theme that we're starting to see come in due to what's happening is the rise of protectionism again. Whether it's the rise of protectionism, in our case, on either side of the Atlantic, you know, both sides are saying, you know, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's what's happening on digital over here, and then it's whether it's the rise of protectionism within Europe itself, with certain countries now, everyone sort of hunkering down, starting to protect a little bit more. This is dangerous, and we have to be sure that that doesn't happen. I think this is all what is needed to ensure moving forward that we do stay solidly together. You know, on the EU-US front, this sort of subsidy race that is potentially on the horizon is not good. And, you know, just I can see, you know, this is a very strong theme, the protectionism piece with certain countries in Europe. We have to just push back on that. European unity is absolutely essential. You know, another aspect to throw out there is, you know, we've got migration, a lot of challenges on our doorstep, how different countries are reacting to that, rule of law issues, and so forth. So there's a lot to tackle in the short term. So it's this balance, short term, balance with make sure we keep the big picture and not forget about it for exactly the reasons that you've mentioned.
I'll be back in a second. That was indeed my next topic, but
I just
Teresa,
want to do a quick 2 fingers on the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I've lived in Brussels long enough to know that Indo-Pacific was a word that you couldn't even say. You couldn't put it on a conference flyer. And now the EU has embraced the Indo-Pacific. They have their own Indo-Pacific strategy. Member states, Germany, Netherlands, France also have an Indo-Pacific strategy. And we see today with the rotating Czech EU Council presidency, it is a landlocked country, and they have embraced the Indo-Pacific. So I think that this is a key sign that it's important. France, in the French presidency, they had also promoted the Indo-Pacific strategy. With the new Swedish government, I'm not sure if they will also do that. But I think it's definitely on the European strategic landscape, and we have to understand that this is all connected. I think that we understand if something happens in the South China Sea, that will affect Europe's economy. So I think that they've traveled a big distance, and we really should acknowledge that.
Well, this speaks for the incredible complexity, and over the last 2 days in our conference, we touched upon a lot of things from energy to digitalization, even to health. So, Radosław, giving your insights into political processes, are we really capable, having enough resources, not in a material sense, but in also intellectual sense, to cope up with these things? This is something which we as a Martens Center, of course, consider ourselves as being part of the discussion. So what can you expect a bit more from these intellectual exchange we have here, from the new ideas hopefully we have created, or what is about the processes even in the parliament? Is there anything you think has changed, has to be changed?
Well, in the parliament, we've recognized realities. I proposed a paper which has been adopted on our policy on China. It should be a nuanced approach. Collaborate where possible, compete where needed, and confront where necessary. And I think you're right that business has discovered that there are geopolitical risks. We have plenty of brain power. The resources is the issue, I think. And we do have a challenge in Europe. You already in the United States had, and I know you represent American companies in Europe, but the shale gas revolution already gave the US a cost advantage in terms of energy. The breach with Russia is augmenting that. If you add the subsidies that you mentioned, which are attracting our companies to the US, and the possible confrontation between US and China, into which we would probably be drawn in some fashion. The US would probably ask us, as they do, are you with us or with our enemies? How do we maintain our competitiveness and our standard of living, with such huge shifts? And my answer to that is that we need to restore Russia as our resource base. But for that to happen, we need to win in Ukraine and have a regime change in Russia and a more reasonable government there.
I would now like to ask Sandra to see what the audience thinks of the future constitution, of where to engage most effectively. Sandra, so please, let us see the results of the Slido.
Thank you, Peter. As you can see, our audience here at the studio, but also online, voted to the question, what would be the most effective method to ensure the strategic security interest of the EU? Overwhelmingly, so 65% voted for intensifying cooperation with non-EU like-minded states. 29% voted for speeding up the EU enlargement process, while 6% voted for intensifying the presence of the EU in international organizations.
Well, that's a quite clear answer, I would say. I will touch upon...
What about strengthening European defense?
That's indeed part of this issue, but I will stick to the 65%. That means our larger family, if I may say so. India has, for example, mentioned the Indo-Pacific. There are a number of states which we consider as democratic partners. What they are, and they are always on the train, on the track, it's another issue. But I think this is also related to the concept of Europe we have in the future. And you mentioned in the beginning that once Ukraine will join EU in whatever way, then of course that is 40 million people that will reshape the landscape of Europe. So will this increase our weight, or do we have to do a lot of reforms internally? Because the constitutional issue is something which we hardly touched upon, but is the big question behind all the considerations. I have to just continue with you, because I think as a member of parliament, you are very much involved in these discussions. It's a big issue for all parties, in particular also for the European People's Party, as one of the founding fathers and mothers of the European project.
Well, I also took part in the conference on the future of Europe, where my group, the European People's Party, proposed things like creating the post of a defense commissioner, creating a joint headquarters for the EU, and indeed a rapid reaction force. When you say constitutional reform, I take it to mean looking at the unanimity principle. And this is a really difficult subject, because under the current rules, it's very easy for France and Germany, who have a pre-coordination mechanism under the Élysée Treaty, taking just two smaller countries to have a blocking minority. So France and Germany have an effective veto power. Nobody else would if we dropped unanimity. I think it needs reform, but I think there is more than one way of getting away from unanimity. There is a simple majority of states. There is a system like in the German Bundesrat, where larger states have up to 5 votes, I think. Smaller states have 3 votes. There is the question of double majority, perhaps when Ukraine joins, which would rebalance the distribution of power. This goes to the heart of power inside the EU. Is therefore this will not be done easily or quickly or without a major discussion.
And that's an issue of leadership as well. And I will refer to a question which one of the guests pointed out, because you had a speech a couple of weeks ago in Berlin and demanding for a, well, German and Polish leadership, which is, well, more than obvious, but considering that the axis Berlin-Paris is the traditional one, yet very much weakened in my observation as well. So I think back to the question of a new architecture, new powers, new axis within Europe, not contradictory necessarily, but complementary, I hope. Maybe just short.
Yeah, we used to have a formula called Weimar Triangle, which was Germany, France, Poland. Poland not per se, but as a representative of its region. I think then it could be useful. But what I said also in Berlin is that Germany needs to decide whether you want a Security Council seat for yourself or for the European Union. And how you answer that will determine other people's attitudes, because you know, if Germany is to become a permanent member, that will make many of your neighbors a bit nervous.
That's a big question indeed. The US will pose, and
well, maybe I could just make sort of a comment just generally about the sort of dynamics in the EU at the moment, less from the security aspect, but just, you know, you mentioned France and Germany, and maybe from the business perspective, you know, what we're seeing at the moment is we need, you know, we've lost something since Brexit. You mentioned Brexit earlier on. I didn't even want to be the one to bring it up. I'm British. But there is a big hole without the UK there for different reasons, whether it be whether it's on security, or they're still playing a strong role with regard to the Ukraine, but with regard to the EU getting things done, being that pragmatic voice. There's a huge hole there that you hear business mentioning all the time. I think there's also a huge worry now with France and Germany. Where is that partnership? It doesn't seem to be a partnership anymore. You know, again, I move back to sort of everyone thinking a little bit more about themselves. You know, who is the true stand-up lead now here in Europe? You need somebody to lead and say, we are pro-Europe. I think that's lacking at the moment. Slightly encouraged by, is it called the European Political Forum that's now been formed? I think this new, which has the UK in it. So I think that's something I wanted to mention. I think constitutional reform, I can't comment on that. We're a non-political organisation. I think this is not the time to start doing some massive constitutional reform. We've got other priorities here. It takes a massive amount of, it's not that easy. We don't want to put our energies into that. We should put our energies into other things with the more immediate results, and simply creating a better understanding of why that first question on there of why we should cooperate with like-minded countries. I'm not sure we're there yet on the storytelling and the narrative outside of the Brussels bubble in the member states about why that's important. And if we go back to the TTIP days, and I look at you, not you personally, but as a German citizen, you know, some of the problems there were in Germany. That there's a lack of understanding about why this is needed. So I think, you know, one of the solutions here is to simply, you asked earlier the question, what can we do? We still need to do a lot more storytelling and narrative telling about why this is important, and not assuming that everyone understands this, because I can assure you that outside maybe this room, in this forum, not everybody gets it. And that's still a big hole. Communications is still a big hole.
Not just, and I immediately up to you, it's not just the Brussels and the European bubble, but going beyond. How are we perceived? Are we really fulfilling the demands? And I look, of course, to the other side of the hemisphere.
Can I make just one comment?
Sure.
Exactly. You know, having recently been in Bulgaria and in Hungary, that, you know, they have massive challenges there. We have a network of AmChams all around Europe, in wider Europe, I should say, 46 AmChams. You know, they're trying to do their piece to be pro-European, but they are being pushed back all the time. You know, there's a pushback all the time from the Russian influence in those countries. It's bigger than I think we think it is. So there's a battle going on there. Then you've also got the investments from China coming into those countries rather than EU investment going into those countries. So they're trying their hardest to remain sort of pro-EU, pro-Western. So I think sometimes we all have a collective role to help more. in their
But
struggle.
the more we have to actively go abroad as well.
Absolutely, you need to
try
get out.
and
Yes, exactly.
Teresa, indeed, that is the Asia-Pacific hemisphere.
But may I just pick up on two points here? A small explosion took place in my brain when you said that we should return to energy dependence on Russia. I would hope that lessons are learned, that we will diversify, and that should be the key. A country like China has so many countries that they get energy from that I think it's really policy malpractice depending so heavily on Russia. I think that this should have taught everybody that there should be a big diversification. There's Norway, Qatar, there's many, many suppliers, North Africa. So I think we have to be much more strategic in our thinking about energy supplies. And I think we are going through a teething period of post-Brexit because with this three-legged stool, it seemed to be more stable. They kind of balanced each other out. You take one leg away and there's a lot of can you imagine what it would have looked like if Chancellor Scholz went to Beijing with the EU Council President and EU Council Ursula von der Leyen and Macron? That would have sent a very, very different message than just one person going. So I think the EU, many people don't understand it, and I think that that's a very key issue. And the EU is very quiet about what they do, I think, especially in these countries where they invest in roads. There's no signs up saying, you know, thank you, EU, for this lovely highway. So I think that these were, the Chinese really have shown us, if we all recall what happened when the leader of Serbia, Vučić, embraced the Chinese flag, kissed it when the Chinese came from the plane delivering PPE, personal protective equipment. And everyone's like, wow, thank you, China. But you know who paid for that plane? The EU. And there was no sign up saying, thank you, EU. So I think we have to play our hand much more carefully. And to your question, please tell me.
Yes, that's how to play it better, the leverage. We look into numbers, for example, the USA development aid, and the largest, I think, if I count all the members and the EU together, the leverage on the ground, as I've observed, for example, in Asia, is quite low. The other part is the communication part, which is a disaster. These little blackheads we see do not correspond then to anything we really pour into from the terms of perspective. So how to enhance the visibility, to the better engaging coordination of actions abroad. Let's take the Asia Pacific as one of the most important regions. Maybe some.
Yeah, although before we, sorry, Radoslaw. I was going to say, I just want to put a call out there for this EU-US relationship again. You know, I can see why you're focused on Asia Pacific, and it's absolutely important. But the investment ties between the EU and the US are huge. They're five times larger. That relationship is huge. You know, we're almost there. You know, we have so much in common. We mentioned values. It's proven that we thrive together. You just nudge it. Why, you know, put our energy in that to nudge that one forward. Indeed, we need to work with the Indo-Pacific, but don't sort of abandon. I don't know whether this is abandonment of the EUS. We need to absolutely focus on that with regard to, you know, we focus sometimes on the differences too much instead of what we have in common. Focus on that, but then iron out these few differences and make some progress there because we absolutely need it at the moment. For, you know, don't shift the attention immediately.
And to pick up, the EU is the biggest investor in ASEAN countries. So they are looking for other poles. They are developing, also investing in India. So I think that these are key developments. Before, people just thought of Asia as China. So I think this idea of diversifying with free trade agreements with both Japan, South Korea, that has helped change the economic landscape as well. And we've seen increased cultural ties. So I think that things are moving ahead. But this idea of how to rebrand the EU, how to bring the message forward, I think we should really tend to focus more on that. I think that the message is getting lost. And sometimes when I publish papers, people are like, wow, you know so much about this strange institution outside of the EU bubble. Not many people, even in the US, are that familiar with how this works. So I think that this is a challenge also for Parliament. I hope that they can spread the message.
Well, I'm the head of the delegation for EU-USA relations, and I'm going to Washington tomorrow. And my experience is that the Americans have finally understood that we are not a NAFTA, that we can do sanctions, we can freeze Russian assets. But just one footnote, we should never have allowed ourselves to become dependent on Russian energy, indeed on anybody else. We should have done an energy union years ago, and we should have been buying oil and gas the way we buy uranium jointly, and using our power of monopsony as the largest customer to get much better terms of trade and to have a diversified supply.
Well, this is indeed topics to be dealt with, and we, for example, as Martens Center, have this transatlantic dialogue, which is an important form of communication to be strengthened, to be enlarged. Triangle relations, I think, are more important. I have, unfortunately, the unpleasant to wrap up a bit the discussions by first thanking all of you. It's an impressive thing, and you are close to our center, so we continue the discussions in different formats. What I take as a key message is indeed the basis of our security of cooperation is the transatlantic relation. This remains, regardless what developments in the Asia-Pacific region will happen, and they will happen, and we have to keep up with this momentum. It's the complexity of policies enabling resources, and this is not a simply government issue that is bringing in all these vast networks, and I'm very delighted to have representatives here in the wider audience and not just in the Brussels bubble, but throughout Europe, keeping in mind that there are different strategic cultures. That's a huge intellectually changing issues, but a very amazing one. So I would like to thank you, all of you. I would like to hand over now to Sandra for the following steps, and thank you to all of you here in the audience.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much.